Some days you think I'm pretty, but some days you think I'm ugly. Some days you'll love me, but some days you'll hate me. If you think I'm not good enough, you might get rid of me. A father's child, a mother's child, yet no one's son. Who am I? Let's unpack. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Shujaa Podcast, where we discuss all matters men and what God says about them. I am your host, KJ Mwangi, and all the other things that I usually say: husband, father, son, friend, mentor, all those things. I am all those things. I am so pumped, excited, because this is part 2 of my own interview. Yes, me interviewing myself. Before I go very far, let's pray. Father, I thank you for yet another opportunity for us to just get to discuss of just how much of an impact you have in our lives. I thank you for giving us this platform for us to be able to share these stories. And for the person at the end of this podcast, I pray, dear Lord, that you may meet them at their point of need. Minister to their hearts. Reveal whatever needs revealing and help them deal with it. I am your instrument. Speak to me and through me. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So in case you're just joining us, in the previous episode, I was interviewing myself regarding the definition of a man. And I was sharing my thoughts as far as what I believe are some of the things that give men identity and make them pretty much think the way they think. So let me give you a quick recap on what I talked about in the last episode. I talked about the definition of a man, specifically my thoughts around, is there a difference between male and being a man? And I also talked about how with great power comes great responsibility. And then I talked about labels and characters as 2 of the things that give men identity. And so this is going to be the second bit of my thought process and the thoughts I have with regard to that. So without much further ado, let's unpack. So I think family dynamics has really changed over the past, I think about 100 years. There is a lot that has changed as far as family dynamics is concerned. And I think at times the roles, the societal roles for the different members of the family, but specifically the man and the woman, has somewhat remained consistent, but at the same time has morphed somehow. And I think it's because of how our century has changed, because there's been a whole lot of women empowerment. And that has really opened up a lot of opportunities for women. And that's a good thing, by the way. And I'm for all that. And I think there's also the fact that men have either been threatened by the women empowerment, or they have seen that as a reason for them to sort of now lay back. Now, just because the woman is empowered, now I don't have to provide as much as I used to, or now I can let that go with her. And so you find there's been situations where women have taken up a significant chunk of the family roles that would be traditionally be assigned to men, or men are the ones who are supposed to take that up to. And don't get me wrong, there's been situations where that happens and you can't help it. Like, let's say if one of the spouse, or rather if the husband, let's say, falls incredibly ill, and maybe they're hospitalized or they've been paralyzed and they can't provide as much as they like. Even if they wanted, they can't provide. So the husband dies, and those are situations that are beyond anyone really. So, but everything, especially the ones that involve a selfishness on the basis of men, like what I described earlier, that the men decide that, hey, since the woman, for example, is earning more than I am, let her do the providing. And the man becomes comfortable with that. I think that due to our own insecurities as men, I think that has really impacts our self-esteem, especially when it comes to those particular roles. And you find now that creates or breeds resentment. You end up having a relationship that is very strained because of your own insecurities as a man. Or maybe it's a conversation that you've never had with the woman in your life about what the expectations are. Well, that is very interesting, because going by what you just said, then it's very evident that societal roles can most definitely contribute to a man getting his identity, or at least provide the basis for him to get the foundation of who he is. And I'm reminded of something that the late Ravi Zacharias said with regard to our quest as human beings, but more so I want to apply it to us as men. And he says that there's 4 fundamental questions that we need to answer. And there's questions about origin, so where did we come from? And then there's questions about meaning and purpose. Why am I here? What am I meant to do? What is like, what value am I adding? What is it that am I supposed to do? Then there's questions about morality. What or who determines what is good or evil? And there's an entire conversation that we can start about that, but that's not the reason why I'm bringing this up. And then there's questions about destiny. Where am I going? And I think as a man, your answer to every single one of these questions determines how comfortable or how self-aware you are with regard to your identity. And that does not mean that you might not have fears. It does not mean that you might not have any form of aspirations, or you might not be how do I put this? You might not be shaken or unsettled by things that happen in life. No, I mean that your answer to these questions, first of all, takes you back to your values and beliefs, specifically your beliefs, because your beliefs determine how you're really going to answer this question, or these questions rather. And once you get the answer to them, then it determines how you interact with life in general. How you interact with your relationships, how you interact with, how you interact with the people that you're in relationships with, the different relationships that you have. It's said that each and every one of us is a summation of the relationships that we've had. Like all these relationships that we have been in, the different type, have contributed to who we are and who we see, or rather how we see life as, in terms of our worldview. And so I think it's important for us as men to really take time and find the basis as to which we get our answers to these questions, because that really determines what our identity is going to be, and it determines what our character is going to be ultimately. So let me give you a story about my experience of societal roles. You see, when I was growing up, me being named after my grandfather, I used to spend a lot of time with him. Every holiday, my mother would ensure that we go to upcountry, and I would go mostly to my maternal side. Very rarely did we go to my father's side. And whenever we went upcountry, I would spend a lot of time with my grandfather, and I would see, albeit I was young then, but I would see how he operated. First of all, my grandfather never entered the kitchen, and he silently, come to think of it, he silently ingrained in me at such an early age that the kitchen was not a place that was meant for men. And he did this subconsciously by, whenever my grandmother would call me to the kitchen, he would refuse. And he would like, no, leave the child alone. He's here with me. Send one of the other ones. And for me, it was not really a big deal because I was really young and I couldn't understand what was going on. But now looking back, I realized that there was such a preconceived notion that I was being exposed to. Now, that notion was in direct conflict with what my mother taught me, because from a very early age, my mother ingrained in me that I was to carry my own weight in that house. So there was from the moment I think I was old enough, from around 9, I think, between 8 and 9, I was taught how to cook. I was in the kitchen doing dishes. I was in the kitchen cooking. I think at some point, each of us had a schedule of who was going to cook. And by the way, this was far above the house chores. You would do whatever it is that you're expected to do, but at the same time, there's your cooking duties. So because of her insistence, I never really had a problem doing what would be considered traditionally as female roles. So cooking, cleaning the house, like actually mopping the house, bending down with a wet rag and wiping the house down. Like that was never a big deal to me because that's what we grew up knowing. And my mother always told me that, hey, I'm teaching you this so that when you get your own place, you will not be a drag to the woman that you get married to, which was an interesting thing when I was like 10 years old, to be telling a 10-year-old that who's not even thinking about girls anyway. But I see now. And by the way, you will hear me talk a lot about my mother and the things that she taught me. And it's not because my dad did not teach me a lot. It's just because I spent a lot of time with my mother because my dad was at work. And my mother was the disciplinarian in the house. And she ran that house with an iron fist. And so most of our learnings around what family expectations were and family roles were came from my mother. Because when my dad came, either he was tired or he was drunk, and we never really got to talk extensively about family life until now. Like now that I'm grown up and I have my own family, we can sit and talk about family life and explore the different things that deal with family dynamics. And that's even to an extent because my dad is not a talker as much. He does not express himself as much. He'll answer questions, but they wouldn't be as expressive as maybe a millennial would be or something like that. But I noticed a significant change in him when my sisters were born. And he started becoming more involved, so to say. He would become more involved in the family life. He would become more involved in their growth, in their homework and stuff like that. And I think maybe it was an outcome of a conversation that they had between my mother and him. But yeah, so I got a lot of my understanding of what societal roles are from an early age, from my grandfather subconsciously feeding me information, but also from my mother consciously speaking into me and molding my thought process with regard to how she felt or how she believed that men should handle themselves. Random question. Have you ever felt adopted?
Whoa. That was random? Like, really random?
Yes. It's because you mentioned something about identity, and I thought about how it's very easy for people who are adopted to be conflicted as far as their identity is concerned. So I wondered, have you ever felt adopted?
Now that you've mentioned it, yes, I have. And I think it was right around class 6. And I think in class 6 I was about 12. Either 12 or 11. I can't remember. Thereabout. And this was the first time I ever thought that I was adopted. And by the way, this has nothing to do with, I don't think adoption is a bad thing. I think it's one of the most noble things that can be done. I mean, God adopts us into his family. That says it all. So the reason why I thought I was adopted, and not just thought, but I believed that I was adopted is, first of all, I don't share the last name like my dad. I don't share my dad's name. My sisters do, but I don't. So, and there's something about African culture and names that gives you a sense of belonging. You know, it gives you a sense of belonging, and you feel like we share a name. This is us. This is part of what makes us us. This is part of who we are. This is our name. This is our family name. This is our heritage. And Africans are very big on that, you know, family name and stuff like that. So I don't share my father's name. And then I don't really look like him much. Like, I am a blend of my parents, but I don't look much like my dad. So I remember I thought to myself, I'm so adopted. These guys have been hiding this stuff from me, and I know it. I know it now. And there is no amount of words that or approval coming from my parents that would convince me otherwise. And so much so, I struggled with it so much that I told myself, I'm going to adopt my firstborn, just so that I can prove to myself that this is actually a good thing. And I'm going to provide for them in such a way that they don't have to think like me. I know I'm adopted, and yeah, childhood is an interesting thing. So I'd always told myself that I was going to adopt. And I remember I shared this with my mom, and my mom was like, yeah, that's a good thing, but you need like the first one to be like yours. I'm like, huh? What do you mean like yours? Like yours, you know, from your loins. Like this is a fruit of your loins. This is like yours. This is biologically yours. Let me tell you, that is like one of the most interesting things I've ever had. Or like to this day, I really try to wrap my head around what that means. Like, you know, the essence of belonging that comes from biological relation is just beyond me. Like, we can't belong just because we don't relate. You know, African culture at times just is just interesting. And the reason why adoption is such an interesting phenomenon to me is because there are so many families that have adopted that are thriving. But at the same time, there are so many families that are biologically related that are dysfunctional and failing. You know, and that takes me back again to the beliefs and values. It's all about what you believe something. Because the Bible is very clear that when we sinned, we were cast away from God. And we were no longer in his presence. Sin separated us from God. But when Christ came and died on the cross to bear our sin, that created a path for us to get back to the Father. Christ says that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. So that act of coming back to the Father is a reconciliation. So because of sin, we were not supposed to be in his family. But yet, his death on the cross creates that path for us to be members of his family again, for us to be adopted back to his family. That's something. That's something heavy.
Yes, indeed. That is quite something heavy. And I'm glad that you mentioned it. So, is it possible for you to name 2 scenarios where your identity as a man, the things that you have defined or you had defined for yourself, where that identity was shaken, confused, or redefined?
2 scenarios. Well, before I tell you my 2 scenarios, I think my journey of getting my identity is very weird, because it's a mix of spirituality and accomplishments. And because I grew up in faith, hearing, going to church, learning about God in Sunday school, that had always been my parents' faith. I usually say that one of the biggest redefining factors for me was when I took up my parents' beliefs and made them my own. And that came from a journey of being a spiritual tourist, if you might call it that. Because I dabbled in so many different, I think I had a stint where I was testing out Islam. I had a stint where I was testing out Rastafarianism. I had a stint where I think I had joined the Jehovah's Witness. I think there was a time where I was dabbling in Mormonism, and like I'd been all through, just searching and searching. But my turning point, which is one of the moments where my identity sort of redefined, is I'll trace it back to the point where I got born again, which is June 5th, 1999. And what happened was, I had been struggling for like 2 years. Struggling with my faith, struggling with my walk, all these questions, and God had pressed my heart. And even when I was doing all these other things, going out at night, drinking, engaging in promiscuity and all that, I was never settled. I always felt like I wasn't fitting in that particular scenario. So this particular time in 1999, towards the beginning, I told God, you know what, I'm getting to my final lap. I've had it with this. So what we're going to do is give me a couple of months. Let me run this course out and let me finish this this going out phase, and then I'll get born again. So there's a friend of mine who's called Ben. Ben was planning to organize a pool party. As of that time, pool parties were not really a thing. They were just one of those things that we see on, or rather in music videos, we see in TVs. So he was planning to organize a pool party. And this is where everyone in Mombasa at that time was going to be. And there was going to be all forms of whatever it is that you can think of was going to be there. And I had promised God that, hey, you know what? This place when I am done with this party, I'm going to give my life to Christ. Well, God, with his interesting twists and turns, ensured somehow that that party did not happen. And I remember sitting by myself in that evening, and I had drunk myself silly. And when I had slept and woken up and I was a bit sobered up, I thought to myself, is this really who I am? And I remember feeling so out of place in whatever it is that I was doing. And that right there was my turning point. And it was as if God was telling me, you've been running away from me all this time. And I am telling you that you are my child. Come back to me. You see, that right there is one of the strongest forms of identity. When somebody who you love or who loves you calls you out in love. Let me explain. When I was growing up, one of the memories that I hold dear to my heart is my dad and I going out for a drive. And he was driving and I was seated in the passenger seat. And then he picked me up, put me on his lap, and let me hold the steering wheel as if I was driving. And I was so excited because I'd always wanted to drive. And it wasn't even the fact that he did that really made it a memory for me. But he whispered and said, "You are my son. I love you." I am not sure he remembers this because I myself don't even remember any other time that he has ever uttered those words. And when God called me out, saying that you are my child, it was like he was giving me an identity. It's like you're acting the way you're acting because you do not know who you are. And you are mine. You are my child. You belong to me. And you have an identity in you that comes from me. And that is why I'm calling you back to me. That to me is the single most redefining moment where my identity was somewhat redefined in my head. And the other one, I think, was my breakup. I've had a number of breakups, but there's two particular ones that stand out. My very first one and the one before I got married. Those two particular ones stand out because I had, in Kiswahili would say, nilikuwa nimefika. In English, I would say I had arrived. Like I wasn't looking for anything else in those relationships. I had arrived in those relationships. But as things would turn out, really, I hadn't arrived. And I ended up breaking up with those two particular ladies. And the interesting thing is that I had immersed myself in those relationships so much that I had lost myself. It's almost like I couldn't identify myself apart from that relationship. So if you think about it, those relationships had become sort of like idols in my life. And when those relationships were taken away, I felt like I did not know myself anymore. It's like I was lost. I didn't know who I was. Like I needed to find myself again. So those are my two moments where my identity have been redefined. The breakups and when I got born again.
So listening to you speak, it's been interesting to hear about the different ways that maybe you view the definitions of a man and the different elements that you've identified with regard to definitions of a man. And I think a man being defined is very important when it comes to his capacity to be responsible and also to execute his role. If a man is not comfortable in who he is, then he's going to drag down each and every single person that he interacts with. And I think for us men, it's very important for us to be comfortable in our identities. Now, this brings me to the main message of this podcast, and it's that God is able to satisfy all our longings, pursuits, aspirations, and desires more than anything in this world can. So as we get our identities, as we get our definitions from all these other things, our labels, our achievements, our societal roles, what is expected of us and stuff like that, the more as we get our definitions from these things, they leave us empty because they don't even measure up to the identity that we have in God. So the statement that says, I am who I am because God said that, or when somebody asks you, who are you? And you say, I am God's child. That is a statement that is loaded. I mean, this is God who declared you his child because you have accepted Christ as your personal Savior. So my summary would be this. All these things in this world that we pursue to give us definition as men, they will never match up to the identity that we get by being in God or by submitting ourselves to God.
So in terms of the biblical definition of manhood, then most comprehensive, sort of well-rounded definition I've found is this. I got this from a book, and the book is called Stepping Up, A Call to Courageous Manhood. And it's by a guy called Dennis Rainey. And his definition of manhood, which is based on biblical text, is this: that a biblical man is one who, controls his emotions and passions. So whether they're single or married, a real man tames his passions. Like you have your passions and desires under control. You don't abuse women, you don't abuse children, he protects them. And the second one is a man provides for his family. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So provision. A man protects his family. This is from the beginning, from the story of creation. We have the picture that man was the one who was set over what is going on and the garden, and he's the one who needed to tend it and take care of what was going on. So protection. Then a man serves and leads his family. It might service and leadership might sound like a contradiction, but this in essence is what Christ did. He showed us that leadership is servanthood. And the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians 5:23 that the husband is the head of the wife, but he quickly puts to rest any notion that this form of leadership allows for selfish male dominance by completing the sentence with, as Christ also is the head of the church. Then he goes on to explain how Christ sacrificed himself for the church, and that is how the man is supposed to lead the wife and consequently his family. And the last one is a biblical man is one who follows God's design for true masculinity. Micah chapter 6 verse 8 says, "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" I think this is at the core of the definition of man, his relationship with God. A man who walks humbly with God is motivated and empowered to step up and assume his God-given position, even in the wake of troublesome situations or difficult responsibilities that might come his way.
So regardless of where you are on your journey of figuring out your identity, what I would like to say is that God is able to fully satisfy and fulfill all your longings, pursuits, aspirations, and desires more than anything in the world can. Man, and we have come to the end of part 2. Boy, this has been an interesting time, me interviewing myself. And hey, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, please consider leaving a review, or you can send us a tweet. Our social media handles is at Shujaa Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Or maybe if you have a story that you'd like to tell, email me at kelvin@shujaapodcast.com. And as always, it's that time where we do our benediction. And our benediction comes from Numbers chapter 6, verse 24, all the way to 26. And this is what it says. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Catch you guys in the next one.